Welcome to this episode in our series on the use, misuse and abuse of jihad in Islam.
It could be the metaphor of a journey where often you
Of course, there are verses that relate to rulings of warfare in
discuss the rulings of warfare in Islam.
Assalamualaikum and peace be with you. Welcome to this episode in our series on the use, misuse and abuse of jihad in Islam, where we will be looking at Islamic textual and historical analysis of evidence to clarify contentions and misconceptions related to the subject or concept of jihad, the Islamic law of war and peace, and the spread of Islam. I'm your host, Muhammad Nuruddeen Lemu, and with me to discuss today's topics are two of our distinguished facilitators with the Dawah Institute, Sister Salatu, Sule, and Brother Ibrahim Bello. You're both most welcome. Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
The topic I'd like us to look at today is one that some view as shrouded in a lot of misconceptions. It's the subject of Jizya. Historically, it was a tax that was charged on non-Muslims as a tribute. Some described it as a poll tax, some looked at it as a military exemption tax. Some understood it to be a form of humiliation. Some understood it to be a way of oppression and financial pressure for people to become Muslims, and that they were being charged as jizya because they were non-Muslims as a punishment for being non-Muslims. I'd like to just start with what exactly is jizya? Where does its authority come from? What is it, Sister Sana?
Okay. When we look at what the Quran says, that in Surah Tawbah verse 29, it's true that there are those who hold various interpretations or who look at the implication of the verse in different ways. The verse actually mentions that fight those who believe not in Allah or the last day, nor hold as forbidden that which has been forbidden by Allah and His Messenger, and do not acknowledge the religion of truth from among the people of the book until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. The various interpretations and implications are things we would look into, but suffice it at this point to just say in summary that there are those who believe that jizya is actually a form of humiliation. It's a way of belittling or disgracing non-Muslims, specifically people of the book. There are those who feel that this particular verse gives permission to fight peaceful Christians and Jews and people who come under that honorific title, the people of the book. Another interpretation which is placed on this, which is part of what we'll be discussing, is that it's meant to be a way of making people pay for staying non-Muslim. So if a Christian wants to stay in the Muslim state and remain a Christian, then they pay the tax. In actual fact, it's important to look very carefully at the context of the verse itself, to look at Sirah, what was understood and practiced by the Prophet ﷺ with regard to this verse, looking at what happened when the verse was revealed, after it was revealed. It's also important to look at the interpretation of these terms and these words, and then speaking practically, historically, what was the practice of jizya? From some of these sources or references, one can say in summary that jizya does not seem to have been used as a way of humiliating. Because when it comes to the practice of jizya, how did the Muslim states or jurisdictions enforce jizya? They did not ask all non-Muslims or Christians or Jews or everybody else to pay jizya. Jizya was actually levied against the able-bodied men, adult males who were able-bodied, who could join the army but chose not to. So in those cases where such able-bodied adult male Christian or Jew chose to join the army, they did not pay jizya. Jizya wasn't levied on the clergy, for example, wasn't paid by women or children. There were very clear practices that showed jizya was levied against, and by jizya we mean, I think for now we'll keep using jizya, because when you say what does jizya mean, you can call it military exemption tax, you could call it just tax, but let's just use the word jizya. That in practice, it was targeting a certain class of the population who could opt out of paying jizya by being ready to be enlisted in the military. Another point to note when we look at what was the practice at the time was jizya wasn't something imposed on all of the wealthy non-Muslims. Unlike zakah, zakah is imposed on everybody whose wealth has reached a certain level, whether that person is male or female, able-bodied or challenged in one way or the other, young or old. So with zakah, you see clear connection between the rationale for it being about getting money from those who have wealth. Just as with jizya, when you use the same measurement, you would see it's about getting either military service or a tax in place of military service. Another thing that's important to mention here is that if we look into Sirah itself, if we look into what the companions of the Prophet ﷺ did, how they saw jizya, how they practiced it, we will find more references that help support the disputes, the argument that jizya was meant to humiliate, or jizya was meant to be a form of financial exploitation, or jizya was meant to be paid in order to remain non-Muslim, which was an indirect way of forcing people, would be an indirect way of forcing people to be Muslim, or that this verse gives permission to fight peaceful people.
Ibrahim, what would you add to this?
Yeah, in addition to what she said, Islam has it that a good number of non-Muslims are exempted from paying jizya. The young, the children, the aged, the incapacitated, the blind, the lame, and a number of those classes of people. You also have the monks, the rabbis, the scholars, men of churches and monasteries, oratories, and all of those people. You also look at it that the Prophet ﷺ did not charge jizya on non-Muslims of Medina. They are non-Muslims, so if it is about difference, religious difference, we should have charged it on them. And like she said, it's not about fighting, actually, because there are two things with that verse. Number one, some use it to justify, like she said, this issue of fight peace-loving people of the book now, since the verse is particular about people of the book. So, secondly, we look at the verse also. If we take it that is about fighting people of the book and subduing them in humiliation to pay tax, now what about the verses that say peace-loving non-Muslims? Of which scholars like Imam al-Baghawi, Imam al-Razi are saying peace-loving non-Muslims include even those you have treaty with them, those that you live peacefully with. So, you can see that it's not about non-Muslims, but like she said, it's what you can call military exemption tax. When in contrast, if Muslims don't charge this non-Muslim jizya, they will be completely disadvantaged in a way that Muslims pay zakat, which part of zakat is to support military warfare. Muslims are recruited, and these people have security and coverage. And in fact, at a point, people like Umar bin Khattab will even order for a sort of pension for the elderly among the Jews who are not able to. So generally, the verse is not about they must pay jizya, humiliated, and is a must. In fact, some scholars interpret when you say anyedin, that is not about humiliation, like subdued per se. It's just that you pay nakadan. Some have that. No, some say anyedin just mean when they submit. So basically, I think from the look of things, we look at it. Jizya is paid by the people of the book particularly, but other categories of non-Muslims can pay jizya if we look broadly. I know people like Imam Shafi and some few mazhab are of the view that only the Ahl al-Kitab, some others believe others can pay. But that's not only the issue, it's more of what is meant for protection of the community. And so it is not about humiliating them. Also, when we look at other verses of the Quran, where Allah says, La yanhakumullahu, I've said that. Also, this verse that said, La ikraha fid din. So if jizya is meant to humiliate them, there wouldn't be all of this. So basically, I think jizya is meant to serve as a way of paying for their protection. And that's why we have it in history, that those of them that were able to fight were exempted from paying jizya. That basically jizya is for non-Muslims that were hostile and were conquered. And that's why one of the options, when we look at the war captives, when we're discussing that in the past, is that some of them can also be given the choice if they want to pay jizya. And in fact, for those who were not even comfortable with the term jizya, they wanted to be called zakat, it was allowed. So basically, there's some level of flexibility. But the intent is the discourse on this issue of fight those who do not believe in Allah and the last day is addressing cases of hostility. It's continuation of addressing issues of hostility with Muslims, basically.
So, from what both of you have said, number one, the verse is in the context of fighting those who are already hostile. And one way of ending the hostility is to agree on a treaty, to agree on some kind of compensation, which is jizya. That's what the verse explains. But as you've already said, what we find is this did not apply to all non-Muslims. It didn't apply to women and those who are not expected to give military service or to be conscripted into the army. It was only conquered non-Muslim men who were able to join the army, who preferred not to be conscripted, that paid the jizya. But as you've mentioned, if, like in the case of Medina, the tribes decide or the non-Muslims decide we're going to protect the state together, I guess a little similar to what we have in contemporary society, the Jews of Medina did not pay jizya because they both agreed with the Muslims in the Sahifa that they would protect the state. I'd like to look at the argument that some have raised. You started touching it on this question of viewing jizya as a financial instrument to punish non-Muslims for remaining non-Muslims, as an instrument of economic oppression that is targeting non-Muslims. How would you respond to that?
Okay, for those who will think like that, the verses of Quran, La ikraha fid din, stands. And the good thing is La ikraha fid din was typically on a man who accepted Islam, and his children, his sons, two of his sons came, who were still Christians. And he wanted to coerce them to become Muslims. So when you say it is addressing Ahl al-Kitab, this was on Christians. And Allah sent down the verse, La ikraha fid din. No compulsion in religion, meaning you can't force them. They were not even given the choice of paying jizya. Just leave them alone. That's what it means. Other verses where Allah says, وَقُلِ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Say, this is the truth from your Lord. Whosoever wills, let him accept and believe. Whosoever chooses not to, fine. Allah only tells you the consequence at the end of these kind of verses. In another verse, he said, وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. So you also have verses where Allah says, okay, you are fighting the hostile ones, which could include the Jew, the Christian, the Ahl al-Kitab, like in the cases of Ahzab. It was a confederation of various religious groups. But Allah is saying, وَإِنْ جَنَهُ لِلسَّلْمِ فَجْنَهَ لَهَا. You know, if they incline towards peace, incline towards peace. So all of these verses are telling you that it's not about forcing them. It's not an economic tool used to indirectly force them. Why? Because you also have exceptions of various categories of non-Muslims. Very various, very varied, really. You have a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ say, leave the Abyssinians alone, as long as they leave you alone, and do not engage the Turks. These people were various categories of Ahl al-Kitab, non-Muslims, some as Zoroastrians and what have you. And the Prophet said, leave them alone. So, it is clear in the hadith that as long as non-Muslims and people of the book are peaceful, they are not hostile, you don't fight them, you don't even need to charge them jizya. Similarly, you have cases during the time of Umar where a group of Arab non-Muslims who were Christians felt uncomfortable with the term jizya, and they gave him the offer whether they should give zakat or sadaqah too, like Muslims give. And he gave them the offer. All of these and numerous examples are just telling us that it is not an economic tool that is meant to indirectly coerce them or humiliate them to become Muslims. In fact, if we look at it in broader context, they are even more advantaged than Muslims. And in fact, to some extent, we can also see some level of flexibility, that the head of state of the Muslim community has some level of flexibility of saying, okay, this should not pay jizya, this should pay this should be exempted. So basically, it's more like exemption, like what you can call military exemption tax, of which issues to do with military and all of that, the head of state have the final say, as long as it is done with the intent of maslaha.
So now what would you add to this? Economic exploitation, was it really about that? What was it?
No, I think we've said again and again that this in practice seemed to be targeting more exemption from military service. We can also talk about the fact that the payment of jizya itself was seen as a way of acknowledging, that is, of the formerly hostile party, acknowledging submission to the authority of the state. And by paying that particular tax, becoming tax-paying citizens, in as much as what they were paying was for a specific thing, but it was their own way of also adding to the running of the security of the state. Another thing,
which gave them protection also.
It gave them protection, yes, because by coming to that agreement and understanding with the state meant they were automatically going to be protected. So they were paying for that protection because they were not going to physically be a part of it. In fact, when we look into history and we use the Ottoman Empire as an example, that was the system they ran, where the Christians and the Jews would pay jizya while the Muslims would join the army. Of course, as with other jurisdictions, the Christians and the Jews had the option of either joining the army or paying jizya. And most of them opted for paying jizya. As a matter of fact, this went on until some of them began to complain to people of other states that they were being exploited financially, economically exploited by the state, but in the state they were actually benefiting because it meant that their children did not go to war, which had the spillover effect of the succession of their businesses, where a father could hand over to his children, to his sons. The sons didn't have to join the army. In contrast, the Muslims, their children had to. So each time there was conscription, it was the children of the Muslims who joined the army, who went to war, who got killed. Or even just by being in military service, they could no longer pay attention to the business. So economically, the Muslims were disadvantaged. After a while, the Ottoman Empire then decided that instead of you could see losing both ways. First, it was the impression being created that they were oppressing their dhimmi citizens, while they were not actually gaining much from them internally. So they then cancelled the option of jizya and just said every member of the state, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jew, should be eligible to be conscripted into the army. This goes back to the point Muhammad Ibrahim just made, which is that it was military exemption tax. It wasn't about their religious status, which would have made it impossible for either Umar ibn al-Khattab or the Ottoman Empire at the time to make such changes. They would have just had to stick with it because the status remained the same. It wasn't about humiliating them for maybe having opposed them before or having sided with their enemies before. If that were the case, again, there would be no exceptions made for them. No concessions given, no change to the policy. but the very flexibility of the policy itself, based on context, showed that this is something that was really looking at military exemption, as we reiterated.
So one could actually describe it as a religiously sensitive tax, a compassionate tax that gave the non-Muslim citizens the option, which Muslims didn't have, because Muslims would be conscripted and they would pay zakat.
Yeah.
And zakat was already more in amount than the jizya. The zakat was being charged on men and women and children and elderly and religious, whoever has the wealth, whereas the jizya was only being charged on non-Muslim men who were able to fight but chose not to. And so for many non-Muslims who were in the state, I think it's easy to see how the jizya gave them the freedom of not joining. And Muslims could easily say, why should we protect these people with, our lives, and they only give a small amount. And if you look at zakat, as Madam Ibrahim mentioned, part of the use of zakat, if you look at the categories of zakat, one of them is wafi sabilillah, which many understood to be in the cause of Allah and supporting defense security system. So one could look at it, when somebody wants to emphasize the economic exploitation, if anybody was being economically exploited, you would actually say it's the Muslim that is being conscripted into the army, whether he likes it or not.
And if the person who's been conscripted, if the Muslim has been conscripted into the army, has wealth that reaches the nisab level, that wealth would be zakat.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But I guess, when you are getting lack of appreciation internally, but also criticism from outside, it made sense for the Ottomans to just say, you know what, since everybody seems to be moving towards equal citizenship in every sense of the term, then equal conscription, equal taxation, and the jizya was abolished. And we'll look at, some thoughts there. Sister Salah, let's move on to this question of humiliation. So if it's not economic exploitation, what the verse of the Quran that, this surah in Tawbah, which actually has been described by some scholars as the verse of the sword for Ahl al-Kitab, for people of the book, and, summarizing the final statement. But what you're saying is it's not as simple as that. When we look at the diversity of conquered and non-conquered Jews and Christians. The question of, is the objective to humiliate? Because some have interpreted that the verse is saying that they should be charged the tax until they are humiliated. What exactly does the verse say, and what's the correct understanding? Is it meant to humiliate? He was mentioning Banu Taghlib as a group of Christians who Umar bin Khattab was actually sensitive enough to agree that the name of the tax be changed from jizya to sadaqah. That they were ready, they felt it was humiliating, and Umar was sensitive to that. How does that go in line with this idea of they should feel sagirun, they should feel belittled or humiliated or subdued or in submission? What exactly does it mean?
Okay, looking at the word in itself, the swagirun, there are those, of course, who say this means humiliation, this means subjugation, in a way disgracing these people. We have spoken at length about what seems to have been the focus, the interest for those Muslim states or countries or Muslim heads of states and territories when it came to practicing this jizya system. That there is nothing that indicates an intention to humiliate or to disgrace. Now, we also have a statement where it said the majority of scholars say that the jizya was to be taken with gentleness as one would receive a debt. Looking at this explanation, it's going back to the idea that what was the jizya about? It was not. There's no evidence to say conclusively that it was about humiliation. Indeed, you have the Arabic term there, but we're talking about going from Arabic to English. How do you translate this? We also talk about how was this understood, how was it practiced, and the key example is the one given by Manan Ibrahim regarding Umar ibn al-Khattab, how he understood it. That once the group who had to pay jizya said, this feels humiliating, he immediately said, yes, then call it sadaqah, because that does not feel humiliating. If the understanding of someone like Umar ibn al-Khattab was, yes, you are meant to be disgraced, you should feel humiliated, then he wouldn't have shifted ground at all. When we also look contextually, as we said, we look at the context of the Quran itself and all the other verses that talk about how to interact and how to relate with people of the book, even with mushrikeen. When there is peace, this particular verse by itself cannot be interpreted to mean they should be disgraced or humiliated. Another point to note is we look at the verse, as we said before, that where Allah mentions qatilu, the speaking grammatically now, that form of that verb implies that this qatilu is fighting in retaliation to those who fight you, which goes in line, it syncs very well with all the other verses of fight those who fight you, fight them if they drive you out of your homes. So that gives us the concept that this is not about trying to oppress someone who is peaceful. This is about pushing back against an aggressor until you get the aggressor to a space where the aggressor submits and is ready to pay that tax. In fact, if we shift it a little bit and say, okay, let's understand this in our own contemporary sense. A country taxes its citizens. If the citizen wants to offend the state, all the citizen has to do is say, I'm not going to pay tax. And we know for countries where their systems run very well, that's considered almost like high treason. How dare you not pay tax? People are imprisoned for it. Their assets are seized because of it. Why? Because there's something about paying tax that shows I recognize you as an authority in this relationship that we have.
Ibrahim, what would you add to this?
Yeah, just like the Prophet ever used to say in Hadith when he sent his military commanders, that they should give them choice of either accepting Islam or peace treaty through Jizya.
To enemies.
Yes. Hostile enemies, peace treaty, whether accept Islam or you give us assurance of peace through treaty, and we know we are free from your threat and you now under our protection, which means you pay jizya or it's war. Why? Because in those states where it was more a state of continuous hostility between you and your neighbor, except you have political alliance and peace treaty, you know the next thing your neighbor might try to expand his own territory by encroaching. It was more a state of conquer or be conquered, colonize or be colonized. So it was very easy to understand this, that was the world they lived in at that time. And so jizya was just military exemption tax people pay when they agree to peace treaty with Muslims, which means Muslims will protect them. And that was why earlier on the contemporaries of the prophets and the generations that live in those earlier centuries, nobody had issue with the concept of jizya Muslims adopt or Islam proposed, because they could see the rationale clearly why. But in our own case, even non-Muslim citizen, okay, where you don't have an Islamic state, for instance, everybody pay for security and defense. In the case of Islam, only the able-bodied men pay jizya. Women don't pay. In contrast, in non-Muslim countries and even in Muslim countries, when it comes to contribution for security, for state and development, it's across the board. Muslim, non-Muslim, women, children, everybody pay. So our argument remains that where you have peaceful coexistence, jizya is just military exemption tax, nothing more. And that is why it is very clear that it was not on all non-Muslims. One, and even on the category Allah said they should charge jizya, is on the able-bodied men. In fact, some scholars go as far as looking at why was this verse revealed. It was when the Prophet ﷺ started heading towards Tabuk, the Roman Empire, when they had some hostility with the prophets. These were part of the verses that permitted Muslims, and that was what led to the expedition of Tabuk. So you could see the rationale and justification. Some other scholars said, no, it's not just about the Romans and the Ahlul Kitab towards Tabuk alone. Even the Jews and the Christians around Medina that were expelled at different instances, because of the existing hostility, this is why this verse is applicable to them.
So what we find is, number one, the verse was not understood to be applicable to the Jews of Medina.
No.
Who had peace treaties. They were not conquered.
No.
And so they didn't pay jizya.
No.
The verse was for conquered non-Muslims. And even when the jizya came to be paid, it was paid by men who would pay that in lieu of military conscription. And I think on the question of humiliation, Imam al-Tabari, Imam al-Nawawi are very explicit that this tax was not meant to humiliate, to embarrass. Sagirun there simply just means that they show submission to the state, that they have accepted the authority of the state. Here we're looking at those who are being conquered, that paying the tax is a symbol of accepting the authority of the state. It is not meant to humiliate. And I think if it was meant to humiliate, the tax would actually target primarily the religious leadership, if it was about religion only. But we find the clergy are actually exempted from paying jizya because under normal circumstances, they are not expected to join the military. What we find in contemporary societies today is we have standing armies. Everybody is charged an amount. It's a little like everybody is being charged jizya today. Everybody is being charged an amount to support the military because we have accepted the nation state as the new structure. By nearly ijma, everybody seems to recognize the nation state or countries today that are governed by constitutions which are our modern versions of the treaty or social contract that bind the citizens of a particular state, where they all agree they will contribute. They all agree if fighting comes, they will all be conscripted. And so when we look at the army of Nigeria or the security services of many countries, you find Muslims and non-Muslims have agreed to serve. I think it's worth noting that Sayyid Abu Ala Maududi of the Islamic State of Pakistan in the early days, when asked why are Christians and non-Muslim minorities in Pakistan not being charged jizya, and he said because they were not conquered. These are indigenous people of that land, and the jizya was only charged on conquered people. And so we find the city of Medina, they were not charged jizya because they were not conquered, and they agreed that they will all be involved in protecting the state. What's also interesting, which is not the subject of our discussion, but I just feel worth noting, is the comments scholars have made that jizya is not a religious requirement that is targeting Christians. If it was targeting Christians, then you would target even the women. You would target their clergy. It's a very mundane requirement of military exemption. It's a mu'amala area where the leader decides whether to charge, what form it would be, and if the people have other services they are offering, that is acceptable. And so they actually cite the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ was talking among the signs of the end of time and the return of Isa alayhi salam, that among the things Isa alayhi salam will do would be that he would abolish the jizya. That if jizya was not abolishable, then it would not have been permitted for Isa to abolish that tax. In other words, it has a very clear function, and it is okay what the Ottomans did when the time came and they preferred to move to a situation that the Prophet had in Medina of that tax. So it's really a leadership decision and for a community to decide what would be fair in their own contexts. I'd like to end there with the discussion. discussions. Jazakumullahu khairan for your input. Till next time, Assalamualaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.